The advent of this seminar on world creation goes all the way back to the very early 90s. And it used to be a 4-credit course. It used to be a 3-day, 3.5-day course at MIT at one time. So it's got a decent provenance. So with that, here's what we're going to do. This is an overview. We'll start off with some definitions. I'll talk about some references. And then I'm going to talk about 2 separate kinds of world creation approaches. Bottom up and top down. We'll talk a little bit about organizing creation. Then we'll do Q&A, and we've got 90 minutes, so we'll have lots and lots and lots of time. At any point during the presentation, if somebody wants to ask a question or something, just go ahead and chime in, and I'll do my best to answer it. We get as far as we get. I'm not a controlling kind of guy, so it doesn't matter to me. You'll notice on the bottom of this chart that there's an address. You remember you went to seminars. That's how everybody came into the presentation today on Zoom. That's where the link was. If you add in the address, if you go seminars/handouts, there's 3 handouts that are available out there. There's a world creation design exercise, and we'll take a little bit of a break around the 1-hour mark anyway. Let people do bio breaks and that kind of thing for about 5 minutes. And that's a good chance, if you haven't had a chance to download some of these things, to do that as well. So no need to go and do that at the moment. And then I hope that at the very end, there'll be frenzied applause. Now, this is part of a sequence of seminars. The only other one I'm doing this year, there used to be about 5 or 6 in this sequence. The only one I'm doing as part of the sequence this year is the non-player character. How do you create memorable non-player characters? And what we're going to do is at the end of this seminar, as a practical exercise, we collectively are going to design a world. Collectively, we're going to design a world. And then during that NPC seminar, as an exercise at the end of it, we're going to try to put somebody, we're going to create an NPC that's actually going to live in this world that we've collectively created. So what are we trying to accomplish here? Ultimately, the goal in role-playing is for the referee, game master, dungeon master, keeper, whatever terminology we're using for the gaming system, is we're trying to suspend disbelief. You want to create an environment where people can sit back and enjoy your creation, your world that you're running in, and push the I believe button. And the things we're going to talk about are in this seminar are all focused to get at that. They're all focused to get at that desired end state. Okay, so what are some questions? So the first question you have to ask is, what are you trying to accomplish when you're doing this? Why are you doing world building? And there's a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons that people may want to do world building. It could be that you're trying to create a lasting work of art for yourself. You just want to do this really awesome thing for you. You may be creating something for others. My better half, beloved Anne, who you'll hear me talk a lot of if you listen to some of my other online YouTube videos, she's a children's author. She's a high school teacher, but she's also a children's author. And in fact, the last time we attended GenCon Live in 2017, she actually co-did this seminar with me, and she did it from a writer's perspective. But a lot of the world creation I do nowadays is for beloved Anne or for some of her writer friends. You might be just creating a palette for marketable things. It could be for a tabletop or a computer game. Is it for a fictional work? Or it could be just a way of releasing pent-up emotions and cathartic. It could be something that's deeply personal. So why am I saying that? Because world building is world can be a very, very, very time and emotionally intensive activity. And I'll tell you a quick story about putting time and effort and emotional energy into something, and it may be not panning out the way you intended. So there I was, right? There I was game mastering. I had a group up in Boston, up at MIT, where I was a dorm daddy. And we played 3 times a week. I mean, it was a very, very active group. And we had about probably 12 or 15 regular players that would sit around the table. So big group, very active. So I just lavished attention on this scroll that I made. 6 different inks, 12 different pens. And I was planning on this particular handout being something that they would use throughout the course of the campaign. There were little hints about things hidden in the scroll work, and there were rhymes that would tell them about upcoming, plot items. I poured myself into this for about 3 weeks, and it was pretty big too. I mean, so it was an 18 by about 40-inch scroll. And it was beautiful. If you had seen it, you would weep. That's how beautiful it was. So there we were. I put it out on the table, and I'm so proud of this. It was like, I was just so proud of it. I put it down, and they're like, ooh, ah, wow. And I was like, oh, great, great. And then the pizza came in. And what did they say? Oh, we don't want to get the table all dirty. So they put the scroll down and put the pizza on top of it. So why do I bring that story up? I still have PTSD about that, but that's not the main issue. The main thing is that you got to think about what you're investing time in and how your players are going to react to it. What you never want to do is put so much effort into something, and then you find that your players are absolutely, absolutely, absolutely not as invested in it as you are. And why do I say that? If you have some idea in your mind, and we're going to talk about balance again, I'm going to emphasize this point. Why? Because the biggest issue I see running into world builders that I try to help out over the years is that they'll get bitter about it. That's a problem, right? They'll put all this effort into it, and the players will be playing, I think the term nowadays is murder hobo. I think that's the term of art, murder hobo. Back in my day, when I first started off, we called it hack and slash, but same idea. And they put all this effort in, and there won't be the response on the part of the players, the appreciation. And what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to ever be angry or bitter about it. I want you to put an amount of effort in. And if you're going to put in kind of above and beyond, I want you to be doing it for you, not necessarily for the players who might or might not appreciate it. So, because at the end of the day, world building should be as much fun for you as it is for everybody else. All right. So, and we talked about this already, but I want to emphasize. So you got to look at what it's worth to you, and you have to figure out how much acceptance by others do you really care about, and how much resources are you willing to invest. And resources are not just time, it's your creative energy. In some cases, in my case with that scroll, for example, it's how much actual treasure, to buy supplies and lavishing that emotional investment. And then what's the opportunity cost if you're doing that? Because if you're doing all this with your world building, there may be other things in life that you're not able to do from a time emotional investment standpoint. So again, balance. Gaming principles. One of the things I like to start every one of these seminars with are these gaming principles, because these really guide everything. And you probably recognize the names Greg Stafford, Steve Perrin, and Sandy Peterson, who were 3 big influences with me. I've known them all for many, many years, I guess back to the late 70s. And it's Greg Stafford, Steve Perrin, Sandy Peterson, all just terrific, terrific game masters, dungeon masters, keepers. But they all have a very different approach to how they do their game mastering. And I think there's something we can learn from each one of them and apply when we talk about world building. So Greg Stafford, who's now passed on, Greg's thing was he always wanted to have a wow factor. He always wanted to make it unique or special or something that was different than anywhere else that you were going to get if you sat at his gaming table or talked to him about game mastering. And I think the application from a world building standpoint is you want your world to be unique. You want it to be special. You want it to be cool in a way that no other world is. And you got to think about what is that special thing? What's the special aspect? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We talk about what's the secret of your world. Every great gaming world has a secret. It's a secret that the players don't necessarily know, but it influences everything that happens in the world. Let me give you an example of George R.R. Martin. George and I had a chance to sit on some world building panels. He used to come to a convention called OddCon in Madison, Wisconsin. He was kind of semi-regular. I went every year. He'd be there about every third year. And he and I sat on some world building panels together. And so when you ask him about Westeros and what was the secret of Westeros, the secret of Westeros, there was a bunch of them, but one of them was the comet. The comet is the thing that brought magic back into the world. So when the comet got close to Westeros, more and more magic came. And when it went away, magic went away. So dragons got smaller and smaller. Eventually they just had these stone eggs, et cetera, et cetera. Winter came, the others marched down when magic was strong. And it was all had to do with that comet because somehow the comet caused magic to be real. I mean, that's just an example. Greg Stafford had a very special set of secrets for Glorantha, which is the world he created. And my world that I've created that hopefully you guys have had a chance to go out and look at and spend some time in, it has some secrets too. Now, the key to it is it's not something that you announce to your players, but it influences everything that happens in that world. So there's this kind of hidden sense of consistency behind everything else, which moves into the next point, which is the Perrin principle. Steve Perrin. Steve is, he's more of a simulationist. So Greg was kind of a storyteller. Steve Perrin is a simulationist. He's a guy who says, okay, here's the rules. We're going to go right by the rules. We're going to roll it. And the thing to do when you think about world building is it has to be consistent. So if something works a certain way in one point of the world at a certain point in time, at a certain point in the campaign, unless there's something that's obvious to the players, that same thing should work somewhere else under the similar circumstances. It's possible to change things, but it should be obvious to the players. Why do I say that? You can have the most highly crafted world in the universe. And if you do something and it makes no sense at all to the players, even if it makes perfect sense to you, they're going to view your world in a frustrated kind of way because it's not predictable. Your world's got to have some level of predictability. And I have a story about this too, a Wall of Chaos. A friend of mine was game mastering billion years ago, 37 years ago. And we came up against something called the Wall of Chaos, and we were trying to figure out how to get through this thing. And he had a perfectly, he had a perfectly logical in his own mind what you had to do to get through this Wall of Chaos. We could not figure it out. And eventually, we were all just so frustrated. We basically said, hey, listen, we give up. I give up. By the by, that's ultimately those experiences are what caused me to become a game master, right? That's what motivated me to do it. I was like, I can do this and I can be consistent and I can do something cool for my players. And then the Peterson principle, Sandy Peterson, any of you who know him or have dealt with him, big Call of Cthulhu guy, has put out a bunch of things through Peterson Game. Several of his sons are involved in the Peterson Game enterprise now. And Sandy's thing is, it doesn't matter what else you do, but you need to make it fun. So he ran, just an example of how Sandy works, he ran a campaign in a mythic Africa. It's the continent of Palmalta in Glorantha in Greg Stafford's world. And he said that in his Africa, in his Palmalta, he was not going to have any elephants. He was like hard over about that. It doesn't fit with my mythology. So his players kept on pestering him, saying, where are the elephants? You know, how can you have a mythic Africa and no elephants? And eventually Sandy said, you know what? It was way more fun for them. So he created the myth of the last long nose. So his players went and found the last elephant, and they had to march it somewhere. And it was a big quest, and everybody loved it. And so Sandy didn't stand on principle, no pun intended. He eventually said, you know what? I'm going to make it fun. I'm going to do something that allows my players to enjoy themselves and be part of this world. Okay, and just out of pure hubris, I had my own principle, which is it's not just those player characters. It's not really player characters that are sitting around the table. It's players. So make sure that you give things that the players enjoy. So those of you, and some of you out in the audience may have actually played with me at various times in different parts of the United States and overseas. And one of the things that I always try to do is I try to include a meal. I try to cook something for my players. And we usually start off in the inn. That's where our sessions start and end often. And so I'll make out a little menu, and I'll give these folks, actually feed gamers. I give lots of handouts. I play music in the background. I do those kind of things because I want the players engaged. I want them to feel that world. I want them to be able to suspend disbelief. And very, very important from my perspective that they want to come to that table every day. And then Sandy's axiom, one of the things I asked Sandy one time, he was coming out and lecturing some very senior people at Washington, D.C., and I was sponsoring him. And I said to Sandy, what's the one thing, if you could tell beginning game masters out there one thing? And he said, you need to include at least 3 senses in your description of every scene. He says, we often do visual things. We often do oral things. But how often do you talk about how something feels or how it tastes or what the smell is? And I try to really bear that in mind. Now, a lot of that has to do with props. And I'm gonna talk a little bit. If I don't remember this, I want somebody to ask me about cinnamon later, okay? Ask me about cinnamon later because it's a cool story. All right. So I spent some time on this, but you're going to see that these are really the foundation for everything we do from this point out. There was a guy named Lawrence Schick who put out a book a while ago, and he called role-playing quantified interactive storytelling. So 3 words, 3 aspects to it. Storytelling, you're telling a story. It's something that should have a plot. It should be engaging. It should have a beginning, middle, and end. It's interactive in that you've got your players you're not just reading it to them. They're going to be giving you feedback and helping you decide what direction things take. And it's quantified in that it's not just all made up. That's where dice rolls come in. That's where rules come in. And you can see where each of the aspects of those principles, Perrin, Stafford, Peterson, fit with this, right? Storytelling is kind of a Stafford principle thing. Interactive's a Sandy Peterson kind of thing. Quantified, that's a Perrin thing. Okay. And I'm not going to go in detail in reading through each of these, but we've got characters, then we got adventures, right? Campaigns are made up of series connected sessions where they're trying to accomplish something, a series of connected adventures. Then we got fantasy role playing. I'm mostly going to talk about fantasy role playing, although obviously this has been used in science fiction. It's been used in all kinds of different settings over the last, holy Moses, 40 years since I've been doing this. Crossovers, multiverse, you can see what those are. Party, and we got player characters, non-player characters, tie-ins, which is where you put 2 plot threads together. We're going to talk about that really from an bottoms-up standpoint later. A MacGuffin, I've seen that spelled a million different ways. That used to originally be a mystery novel term, but essentially it's a plot device, something that's designed to incite player interest. It doesn't always work, by the way. You got to be careful about how you use your MacGuffins, because sometimes you think, hey, this would be super cool if I did this. but in actuality, the players are less excited about it than you are. So again, that goes back to that balance and how much you invest in things. All right, so selected references. I am going to, on the site after this is all done, I'm going to provide a copy of this in PDF form, so don't worry about writing all these down now. And you can imagine that this list has grown and grown, and some have dropped off and some have been added. Probably the most recent addition to this is the Kobold's Guide to World Building by Jana Silverstein. That just came out not that long ago. Other things have dropped off. And of course, a good place to start with world building is always my website, right? drgames.org. So, but the point of this is if you're a world builder, there are so many different things you want to take into law. So Introduction to Canon Law by James, this actually talks about how do you create a religious set of laws. And in a lot of your worlds, there's going to be religions. And so knowing how to make a religion in a consistent way, super important. Basic Country Skills, great book because it talks about, let's say you got nothing. How do you build a fire? How do you forage for food? All those kind of things, which are important things to know if you're the game master and people are going to go out in the wilderness at some point. Old Wives' Tales, great thing, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm going to have this out there. I'm going to have this out there on the site, at the download site, once we're all done. So if you come back on Saturday, Sunday, and you go out there, you can get a copy of the slides. They'll be out there for you. So don't worry about writing all this down. Okay, what are some useful supplies? I think that in the same way that if you're a poet, you should always have a notebook with you, or a writer. In the same way as a game master, as you walk through life, you're going to see things that are going to inspire you. And whether that's notes in your phone, or some type of a handheld device, or a notebook, it's just something that's useful to have. Same thing with a camera and a phone. I take a lot of pictures and I use a lot of things that I've used in my world over the years. Much of it is inspired from life. And then all of these other things are ways to draw in, and all of these physical things as well as their counterparts that you can do in the computer. All of these things as well as counterparts that you can do in the computer. On my computer, and I was joking with some of the folks who are on here earlier, when I plugged in initially my microphone and my headphones, my computer didn't realize that I was going to be using kind of my low-tech headset that I've got on right now. It wanted to go to these other high-end things that I have. But I do a lot of things on my computer in terms of painting and musical sketches, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I've described some physical things here, but think about these in terms of, computer and or handheld counterparts as well. Also, Campaign Cartographer from Pro Fantasy. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful mapping tool. They've got a whole series. They got an outer space version where you can do planets and sci-fi kinds of things. They've got a dungeon version, city versions, etc. I find it wildly useful because players love maps. They love to be able to visualize the world that you're describing to them. Okay, so we're gonna now delve into the meat of this, and the first thing we're going to start off with is a bottom-up campaign world creation. The first thing is that this is the most common method that people use to create their fantasy role-playing worlds, or your science fiction world, or your mystery world, or whatever it is. And it's a natural outgrowth of your campaign. It's also probably the easiest method. What's the downside to it? The con is it's potentially inconsistent. So one example of a bottom-up campaign is if you do a prefab campaign. So if you take anything off the shelf from a manufacturer, or if you go to RPG Now, Drive By RPG, or any of those sites, and you download something from somewhere and you use a module, that's an example of a bottom-up. And the way it works is you add things as the characters move from one adventure to another. You add things as they move from one to another. And we'll talk in subsequent charts about the specifics of it. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview first. Again, It's probably where everybody, well, almost everybody starts. It's relatively easy, but it can be inconsistent. We'll talk a little bit more about that. All right. So first, it's developed on what I call a need-to-know basis. It's a need-to-know basis. So first, what you do is you think, as the game master or dungeon master or referee, you think about your player characters. What's their area of influence? What are the things that they can reach out and touch, that they can control, that they can see, that they can sense, their area of influence? And influence can be social as well as their five senses. And then bigger than that, well, hopefully, right? Unless we go back to the term of art nowadays, murder hobos. Unless they're murder hobos, they're probably going to have a somewhat larger area of concern. So these are things they can't influence directly, but they care about. So these could be things, let's say in a fantasy setting, they're in a very small little barony or something, a little area, but they're probably concerned about what the Duke's doing at a level above them. And maybe beyond that, they're worried because the king's gathering forces for a battle somewhere. And they're worried about what's going to happen. And maybe there's some chance that will move into there eventually. It's outside of their area of influence, but they may be concerned about it. So you have to lavish attention on that area of influence, and you have to think about what are the PCs interested in doing, what kinds of things would they be aware of, how do I describe that to them in a way that makes sense from their perspective. But then you also have to flesh out, and it can be in a more logical and timeline standpoint, that area of concern. And when I think about that area of concern, that kind of pink and puce area there, I think about that as occurring off stage. These are the things that occur off stage that are influencing what's happening in the spotlight, which is those PCs' area of influence. And then at a minimum, you have to develop those two areas, but you're probably going to do something a little broader too, right? A little broader. Now, let me give you an example of a great story about the inconsistent piece of this and how this can be inconsistent. Tom Woke, who's just passed on this last year, good friend of mine, was a game master, and he talked about how he was trying to cut out a long overland journey for his player characters, because his players had complained bitterly about the last time he had a wilderness adventure, and there were all these random encounters, and they kind of got wore down. By the time they got to the place that they were going to go and explore, they had to rest for a couple of days to heal up and things. So he was gonna be nice, and he gave them as what they found in this treasure trove at the end of the previous adventure, kind of wrapped things up. The previous adventure was they found this teleportation device, which had just enough range to get them to that next area that they wanted to explore. And he gives it to the party leader, and what does the party leader do? He goes, wow, this is super cool. So this can go, 100 kilometers, right? 60 miles, right? And Tom goes, yeah, I can. And he goes, that is awesome. I always wanted to see, and the rest of the party's all excited, and he teleports them somewhere absolutely that Tom had absolutely not set up. He said, I really want to see this because I heard about this at one time in an inn. And the thing with bottoms up is, and that goes to that area developed by the game master, you got to think about if your players are really the inquisitive type. And Tom's players didn't do that to be mean. They just kind of assumed that since Tom had talked about it previously, that yea, verily, he probably had developed that and he knew about it. So Tom had to do a timeout. Guess what? We're going to have to do that next time. I know we're stopping a half an hour early, but that's okay. Great job, everybody! Congratulations, and I'll meet you in the lands of the north in the next session. So you're gonna have to go a little bit beyond that area of concern, because you just never know what player characters can do. But you don't have to go too far beyond that. Oops, let me go back one. So what are some advantages? Well, first of all, that development of the campaign's natural. It grows, your world grows and matures as the campaign grows and mature. And you're able to see by what the players do and what they have access to, what needs more development. So when we talked about that balance in world development earlier, you're actually able to see in a very real way, and you get real feedback in real time on where you need to lavish your attention. So not so much wasted effort, right? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about 3 again. Also, the players are helping you figure out. The players are helping you figure out what you're going to develop in the world. And so you're going to put some time, talent, treasure into things that they're interested in. And there you go. So, and I give the example here about clothing styles. So some parties may be very interested in that kind of thing. They want to know what the fashions are and what are people wearing? What are the popular colors in this season? And some game masters might not be all that excited, or vice versa. You may be all in on clothing styles and things, and the players may not care at all about it. This, by doing bottoms up and seeing what they're interested in, what they're asking questions about, where they're heading, will help you focus your time. All right, so now what are some disadvantages? Well, it's your world, but you have less control in the world design as opposed to top-down, which we're going to talk about next. We talked about the potential for inconsistency. So one of the things that's really important in this is if you're adding a new module and if you're not developing something from scratch yourself in terms of the next adventure for your players, if you're pulling something from a published site or somebody else's world, you've got to be careful to ensure that it's consistent. You've got to be sure that it's consistent. And that's going to take some time. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to map between the organizations and people of interest, the NPCs of interest in one module and trying to map them into another. And if you get caught and you don't have enough time, you may say something in one session and live to regret it in another. One of the hardest things to do as a game master is to walk something back. And that goes to parent principle, right? Consistency from time to time and session to session in your world. We talked about Tom Woke and his being caught off guard. I think that can happen a lot. I would tell you, as a very, very, very experienced dungeon master, game master now, literally been doing this for 43 years. Now if I was Tom, I would have just given them some generic description of what it kind of sort of looked like. And you can always find things to occupy and interest your players. And I would have done it just long enough so that I could have walked off the stage and come up with something. And I would have taken notes, careful notes. And then the final thing is, if you're going from one module to another, so let's say that, you got something that's set in the Dark Sun world, and the very next thing, I don't know, it's in the Ivory Coast or something in another part of another world. It can be very, very, very artificial, that connection, unless you're super careful. So if you decide that you're going to have, the world of Kryn in your universe, right? And you're also going to have Arkham, think Lovecraft, that can be contrived at best. Now, let's go back to George R.R. Martin and Westeros. If you've actually looked at some of the big maps of his world, you're going to see Lovecraft kind of versions of it. You're going to see Tolkien-esque aspects of things. You're going to see the all kinds of different worlds that are mixed into his Westeros. George R.R. Martin's Westeros is, yes, it was designed from it was a top-down world, but it was really kind of hybrid because he did include aspects of other people's worlds in it. But he did a very good job of making it his own and making it consistent. Okay. And this is just an example, right? Hey, one module there mentioned that the reason that these people were all fleeing from something the party ran into is they were fleeing the orc invasion. And then Eventually the party gets to the place where the orcs were supposed to be, and there's no orcs, because guess what? You're not playing that module anymore, and you forgot about that. You forgot about that. So you just have to be consistent. All right, so bottom up process, where do you start? So first thing is you got to identify those key areas for geographic areas. What does the geography look like? How is the party going to be interacting with that? Is it mountainous? Is it temperate kind of climate? Is it near an ocean? What's the weather going to be like in broad terms? What time of the year is it? Because those things are all important. They help people suspend disbelief. And then identify the key groups. Are there orcs? I don't know. Maybe. Are there lawful religions, or are there no religions? Is it a shamanistic society? I don't know. But that's what you have to come up with when you do this bottom-up process. If you're using published modules, one of the recommendations I would make is go through and figure out which of the groups, which of the non-player characters you want to use, and then I would edit out the things that didn't really fit, or that are going to be more trouble than worth to you from a consistency standpoint. Then you got to develop relationships between those key areas. So you pick up the next module, you think about where the player characters currently are, and ideally you do this in enough time so that as they're playing, you can drop hints about this next module they might be playing in. And oh, I heard that somebody was kidnapped, and just dropping little hints. So when they get to the next module, they're already kind of familiar with some of the things that are maybe going to occur. Again, you're always going to want to go one level past what those player interests are. When you do have non-player characters, a lot of times in published modules, they'll have very specific motivations that are related directly to the plot hooks and plot devices in that module only. When you go through, I would redline those, and I would have them have more open-ended NPC motivations. I'm going to talk in the Creating Memorable Non-Player Character seminar, which is the next one in this series, and I'm going to talk more about what open-ended means. But just broadly, it's things that are not necessarily going to be capped. So accumulating wealth, there's kind of no end to how much wealth. Accumulating knowledge, accumulating power. Those are all open-ended kinds of things, as opposed to, I'm going to buy this plot of land. Well, and then when you do that, your bucket list is empty. Is it time to move on to your great reward? I don't know. But better to have an open-ended NPC motivation. We talked about consistency, and then those individual groups that you have, whether it's a clan or a societal group like the Orc Village or goblins or kobolds, or whether it's people from another nation or a tribe or something, however you're defining those groups, they each ought to have their own motivations and goals. And then if you want the players to go on to the next module that you've bought, because, hey, you spent $20 on it, you probably do want that. Shamelessly place MacGuffins, things that the characters are interested in. So if you have a mage who's very interested in accumulating knowledge, talk about the lost library of the great, the great Cheesy the Mage, or Mango the Mad, or somebody. If you've got a fighter who's very interested in kind of creating a series of heroic legends, talk about this monster, this really tough monster that just happens to be in the area this next module is going to take place. Think of yourself as feeding cheese to your players. You're giving them what they want. It's making you happy. Look at those mice, they're happy. The player's happy, you're happy. So just don't be afraid to feed cheese to your players if you're doing bottom up. Okay. Be willing to discard. We talked about that already in terms of sometimes modules are very complicated if you're bringing something in, or maybe you want to bring in part of the Lord of the Rings, mythos into yours. You don't have to bring in the whole world. You might just bring in Mirkwood, or you might just bring in an evil semi-immortal sorcerer, whatever it is. But just bring in the part that you are most interested in. Sometimes not all modules are created equal. Some of them are not all that some of them are very good in some areas and not in others. You have to accept that. We live in a human world. So if there's material that's light, in particular, if it's something that your characters care a lot about, I'll go back to the fashion thing. A lot of modules don't describe the clothes people are wearing, but if your party's all in on that, then you've got to feed them that cheese. So maybe you go through and you make some marginal notes. Hey, this is the kind of clothing they're wearing. These are the colors that are popular, et cetera, et cetera. One of the biggest things you got to watch out for is motivations. Every one of those non-player characters and or creatures or adversaries that they're going to interact with should have some kind of a motivation. Now, I'm all into ad libs. I'm all into making decisions, but you ought to keep a campaign journal. And that can be something in a handheld. It can be an iPad. It can be a notebook, whatever it is. Keep really good notes as you go through. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. One is consistency, back to parent principle. Second thing is if the party showed a particular interest in something, maybe that's something that you can add as a sense of wonder or something that's cool, Stafford principle. And then finally, notice the things that they really light up and they're excited about and where there's laughs at the table. Those are all things to keep notes on and give people more what they want. That's right. Also, you got to be willing to accept suggestions from the party. They're going to be a lot more willing to work with things. Sometimes that's going to be a challenge, but in a lot of ways that will help you grow as a game master because your players may suggest things that you wouldn't have thought of. Well, they definitely will. If you have a good creative group of people, they're going to suggest things you wouldn't have thought of, and it's going to help you expand your repertoire and help you become more creative. And then characters and plot lines are the things that are going to keep people engaged for the long haul. So lavish your attention on there. Yes, locations are important, material kinds of things are important, but if they really enjoy talking to your non-player characters and interacting with them, if your non-player characters provide logical, reasonable directions that the campaign's going to go, that's going to be huge because they're going to be the way that your party interacts with they're going to be the way your party interacts with the world. And then plot lines. Try to do things that are creative. One of the questions I sometimes get asked is, how do you come up with plots? It's kind of after you build your world, but I'll just talk about it briefly. One of the things that I find is useful, and that's why in my references I talked about mythology and how do you write a murder mystery and those kind of books. But I find that Westerns, if you're using fantasy role-playing, Westerns are an often overlooked source of plots. If you go get a whole series of Louis L'Amour books, the chance that your other players have read them is small. But on the other hand, of course, you're probably going to change the names unless you're running a space or, Western fantasy thing. But that said, it seems like Westerns are very similar to what we do in fantasy role-playing games in that you got a small group of people. There's usually a well-defined set of bad actors, and they kind of do the same things we do. Somebody's been kidnapped. Somebody's taken over the mine. All of the things that we do. And I find it to be a wonderful, wonderful source of motivation. Okay. So here's an example of a bottom-up development in my world. My world is really a hybrid world. It started as bottoms up. It was a bottom-up place. I started kind of doing my own module development though. So I would take a module. This is back in 1977. So it was a long time ago, but I would take a published module and then I would create adventures that would fit with that. And then we would add something new. This was back in the heyday of Judges Guild. Judges Guild, you used to be able to put $10, slap it down on the table, and you'd buy a whole campaign for $10. And it was newsprint, and it, the production quality of it wasn't fantastic, but the volume of information you got was unbelievable. You could play off of the City State of the Invincible Overlord for 10 years if you wanted to with all the information in there. But so at some point, though, I said, listen, there's just too many inconsistencies. There's too many things that I want to include, and I created a top-down world. But this is an example. Within that top-down world, now I do bottoms-up kind of thing. So I started the party we started, and this was in 1996. In 1996, this is what the world looked like. Well, not the whole world, but this is the area that we're going to develop. So I knew that there was going to be a place called Kernan. It was in the kingdom of Temeria. And there was something called Veldman's Needles, and there was a temple out in the Great Waste. And you notice I've stolen things. I've stolen things from other sources. I've stolen things from other sources. So again, hybrid kind of world. And this was kind of it. So people would adventure around and they'd go find a cave and they'd find some gold. And I said, you know what? I need to give some more detail to this. So then in 2011, by 2011, and from that 5-year period, from here until here, this town of Balkan, which is not far from Kernan, got developed. So there were actually these people and these locations, and there were non-player characters associated with each one of these things, and there was all kinds of more detail. So for example, let's see if I can find the Frog Leap Inn. The Frog Leap Inn was actually run by a guy named Schmeppel. Schmeppel wasn't very bright, but he had a 3-legged pig named Rosie, and Rosie was super smart. The pig was super smart, and the pig kind of ran the inn. And so that's fun. That was a fun thing, and people still talk about that to this day. That wasn't around in 1996. So as the players decided that they wanted to have a base of operations, they wanted to get to know who the NPCs were, etc., all of these things developed. And then what happened? Well, then I had to figure out, how does this connect? So where are those Veldman's Needles? Well, they're here. And then there's a monastery of healers, and then Balkan is here. And then there's a place called Gebnik Glade, which is a forested area. So as time went on, there became more and more and more of a need. There became more and more of a need to develop the details surrounding that world. And then you move on forward. Now they wanted to go north of there. So I had not developed the area north. So in the previous map, it would be the bottom edge of what I'm showing you here. And it was just this kind of rough geographic thing with 2 roads on it, more or less. And then by the spring of 2012, I had put in some major locations, and there were some ruins in there, and there was a volcano, and I put in some rivers, and I actually divided this into a series of baronies. And then they wanted to go explore a particular area. So guess what? Now I had to have more detail, and because there had to be things for them to interact with and goals, etc. And then finally, part of what they had to do was go clean out an area. And the last week of summer of 2013, you can see all the way on the right-hand side the level of detail that I had to develop for them to actually do sessions. But you can see it was a natural kind of progression. I didn't do this all at once. I didn't have the level of detail that you've got all the way in this last panel in the lower right, way back when in 1996. It wasn't there. And I didn't need to. I just kept one step ahead of the players, and they were delighted to learn more and more about the world and tell me the things that they were interested in and give me a chance to co-create that world with them. All right. So now we're going to go into top-down or deliberate world creation. So at this point, I think it's probably good. We've been going for about 40-ish minutes now, about 45 minutes. We got about half our time. And we're going to, a lot of it was the upfront piece talking about the principles and things. Does anybody have any burning questions that they want to ask about bottoms-up world creation before we jump into top-down or deliberate world creation? Anybody? Okay, moving right along then. So top-down world creation. First of all, it's very time-consuming, and I'm not going to fool you. It's relatively difficult, but I think it's incredibly rewarding. The main benefit of it, and I talked about it earlier, is it creates a very, very, very consistent world. You know everything about the world because you created it. The one thing I would say, if you're starting off and you're just creating a world for the first time, I would not begin with top down. I would start off with a bottoms up, just to get until you got your feet. Okay, so how does this work? You start off with the cosmology. You know, where did the universe come from? And then you work all the way down to the details. And the example I give here is the size and shape of the sand grains in the Hobbit's sandals. And I call this kind of the calculus textbook approach to world creation because everything's added. It has to be logically consistent, and it flows from your earlier decisions. And you see one example here where these kids are describing, they're actually dissecting a frog, but they're describing, you know, how the world works from that. So what are some advantages? You've got total control over the development of that world. It's going to be logically consistent. Well, at least as logically consistent as you can be. You're not going to be caught off guard because it's your world. You can say anything you want and you kind of know how it all works. And I got to say that of all the creative endeavors I've done, from writing books and doing all kinds of things, this is probably one of the most rewarding things that you can do with your creative energies. And I have an old saying, you know, that game masters never die. They just become deities in their player's campaign. I will tell you that there's probably hundreds of campaigns that have been run in derivatives of the world that my players have played in over the last 43 years. There are literally hundreds of campaigns have sprung from the loins of this world. So that's kind of a cool legacy if you think about it. All right. What are some downsides? Well, the players don't have as much input in the creation. That might or might not matter. If they do have input, like they do in a bottoms-up piece, it kind of guarantees that they're going to be interested in the details you add. On the other hand, if you do a great job at this, nobody's going to care. They're just going to all look at it. You guys probably really enjoyed Game of Thrones, or you might really enjoy the Marvel Universe, and you didn't have a whole lot of input into creating it. But those are well-designed, consistent, interesting worlds. And so you can push the I believe button, you can suspend disbelief, and you don't, just because you didn't have a direct say in the development doesn't mean that you won't enjoy it. The main thing is it's very, very time consuming. If you're going to do a good job at this, it's going to be very, very time consuming. And back to return on investment and balance, if you're not going to spend a long time campaigning in that world, then you may run the risk that you're not going to have get the output from it. You're not going to get the return on investment. The amount of time you put into it's not the amount of enjoyment you may get out of it. Not saying you won't. Again, people create worlds for all kinds of reasons, but you run that risk more than you do with bottoms up.
I'm thinking. So no reason to suspect anything. No one told us anything. I'm trying to think if there is any leaves, but yeah, no, I will.
Okay, so it goes back to cost benefit, right? You have to understand what your personal goals are and whether or not you want to invest in this or not. So here's the process. First thing I would do is say, select a gaming system. And you might say to yourself, well, why? Because I'm creating a world and then I'll develop the gaming system. Maybe, but if it's the first time you're doing a top-down process, I recommend that you select the gaming system, because now you don't have to worry about mechanics or the feel of the actual instantiation of your world. Is it possible to design a gaming system after you design the world? Yeah, I've done that. I've actually published some gaming systems and gaming worlds, co-published with authors who've got their gaming world or their fictional world, and then I helped them create a game around it. You can do that. I would tell you, though, that if top-down's not the first place you want to start with world creation, then designing a world and doing a gaming system would also not be the second choice. I would make sure that you were really facile with the world creation process and had played in it a while before you decided that you were going to start doing gaming systems. Then you've got to determine the scope of your world. So if you're all into quests, you want a larger scope. If you want more details, that means you probably not going to have enough time to develop all those details, so you want a smaller scope. If people are going to explore things, it might be larger, but you might gloss over some of the details. Lots of travel related to exploration, larger world. Tech level, higher tech level, larger world. Then I would develop the cosmology. What are the myths in your world? What are the commonly understood myths? And what really happened? You know, you were there when this universe got created. You know exactly what actually happened. It was, God knocked his elbow over and his cup of tea fell over, and that was the world. I don't know. Whatever you decide is reality is reality. And then you have to answer fundamental questions. You have to answer some fundamental questions. Why was there a creation? Is there a was behind it? Why are your player characters in those worlds? And what happens when people die? Etc. You need to answer those questions, or you explicitly need to not answer those questions. You can choose not to, but you need to decide. It's all up to you. Physical laws versus magic versus psionics. You have to figure out what works in your world. You got to figure out what works. And I want you to think about this, and we're going to come back to this, but I want to foot stomp this. You got to think about this as a switch. The closer your world is to Earth and the world that your players play in every day, the less explanation of things it needs. But in some ways, the less cool and less special it is, right? So higher on the Perrin side of things, but lower on the Stafford side of things, if it's essentially Earth 1.0. The more and more interesting and cool and different things you add, the more Stafford principle you're incorporating, the cooler it is and the more unique, but the more explanation it might require. And eventually you get to the point where you cross a line where it's hard for your players to suspend disbelief because they don't understand what's going on. It's so different than what they know. It's hard for them to wrap their arms around it. So, and again, I'm foot stomping this. So the weirder you make your setting, more interesting, but more difficult for players to suspend disbelief. And what's this all about? It's all about allowing people, facilitating the suspension of disbelief. All right, and then the second part of this. So now you've got the broad process set up. Now you're actually going to put your hands on the clay of the world. You want to develop it. So start with the geography. Are there large bodies of water? Are there lands? Is it a series of island archipelagos? Is it some one big massive monocontinent? Is it something different that's kind of a mix like what Earth is? What's the climate like? And then you got to think about, what do you want special in your world? What are some peculiar kinds of things that you might want to highlight? Particular features, peculiar features, things that are going to make your world unique. And then you populate the world. You put the intelligent creatures in your world and you put them in general areas. And then this is the key thing: food chain energy cycle. So yes, magic can exist, but if you explain away everything with magic. So when I first started playing, you'd kick in the door in a 10 by 10 foot room and there'd be an elder red dragon inside. Well, first of all, how does the red dragon fit in the 10 by 10 foot room? And what does it eat? It's magic. Okay, that only goes so far, right? That only goes so far. If you're doing a top-down world, you probably ought to explain, all right, where does the energy in the world come from? In our case, it's radiant solar energy, right? That's kind of how our world, mostly 90% of the time, that's how it gets its energy. I mean, but there could be something else in your world. If you think about the Underdark and D&D, they have different energy cycle in the underworld than they do in the above ground world. Now, based on geography and climate and just basic science, you can probably map out where, left to its own devices without magic or other influences or divine influence, there'd be fertile areas and waste areas. And then maybe there's other reasons. Maybe other things went on. Maybe there's mythic reasons why a particular area is a barren wasteland, even though normally it would be a thriving area. Certainly my world has some of those kind of things where ancient battles took place, or really truly world-changing events occurred and changed the makeup of the geography. So then think about that, going back to the food chain. What's the base of your food chain? Are there herbivores? Is it something that absorbs the native magical energies, the mana? And then you put the predators, and then you work your way all the way up to the apex predators, which most of the time in your worlds are probably going to be creative, intelligent creatures. All right. So, and I said this already, you don't have to work off the sun and carbon-based ATP cycles. And so those of you who've taken biology know what I'm talking about. But you have to, if you have an energy cycle based on something, it adds a logic to it. It makes it more consistent, parent principle kind of stuff. But also, people might be competing over something. So if there's only a certain number of creatures that are in that world that are able to absorb the kind of energy that things need to survive, there may be competition over that. And all of your plots, your best plots, are going to revolve around competitions. Okay. Then develop those cultures. So put them in the world. What type of intelligent creature is associated with a particular culture? Is a culture a blend of more than one species of intelligent creature? I don't know. I mean, I would say that's a difference between like a Tolkien-esque world where the intelligent species were all different, right? Versus something like the Shannara series, where they all kind of worked together in the Four Lands, and there was a lot of intermixing of them. So, but that's the place you start. You start with a culture, which is this shared set of beliefs, shared language, shared expectations. Very important, because that's going to help add that consistency to your world. It's also something interesting for your players to learn about, not just your player characters, but your players. Then what are some items of interest? Where are your important resources? What are the subsistence patterns? How does this all work? And again, because you're looking for places that you may have conflict. You're looking for places you might have conflict. Do you have religions in your world? What's the tech level? Are there different tech levels and different amongst the different species? How are they structured from a societal standpoint? Are they hunter-gatherers? Is it some type of feudal system? And then think about symbolism and languages and things. Do these people all do things is 5 a very important number to them? Is 7 an important number? Do they build things based on these structures and patterns? And then you tie it all together. So you want to think about resource competition. Where in your world are one or more intelligent groups going to be competing over resources? And how do they deal with that conflict? Is there going to be trade between the different species and the different cultures and the different large cities? What are the reproduction rates? And then again, emphasizing conflicts. Conflicts are going to be very important in your world, because that's the opportunity where adventures can take place, right? I want to talk a second about reproduction rates. I want you to think about reproduction rates very, very carefully. They have to make sense. So for example, if halflings have gestation periods of 4 months and they have litters of 12, then unless there's been, lots and lots of disease and starvation, your whole world's going to be full of halflings. And if elves only reproduce once every 1,000 years, but they're not immortal per se, I mean, in other words, they can be killed, then essentially you're going to have no elves left after some period of time. See, you really have to think about that. You really have to think about, does your reproductive cycle make sense in the context of the demographics of your world? And people sometimes don't think about that. That's one of those things that your players might not actively question. Some of them will, right? Because it's just fun to poke in the eye. But even if they don't, they're going to go, huh? And part of their brain's going to go, error, 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 makes no sense. So it's always better to think these things through and be consistent, parent principle, right? One of the things that I find that's very useful, and this is a learned thing, that probably the first 5 or 6 years I was a game master, I didn't do a good job of that. Conflict's all good. It's good to have things that are threats to people, and for the party to be able to go out and deal with those threats and be useful and make themselves feel good about what they're doing. At the same time, if you're constantly fighting, it's exhausting. They have to have some kind of a base of operation with people that care about them and support them and are willing to give them succor and rest, because it also helps your players to mentally recover. Eventually the shock value wears off. If every time they come to the gaming table, it's either a total party kill, a TPK, or close to it, eventually your players are going to get exhausted and they're not going to come back. And again, this is something I learned the hard way. So I want to share that with you early on. It's always good to have in your world some reasonably safe, secure, stable place that adventurers can come from, where not every time they turn around they're facing an existential threat. All right, and then the final piece is make the nations, and that's that collection of folks that have a similar society. They have religions. This is where you now put in your major non-player characters, the people that are going to be the influencers in your world. Do they have laws, customs? What are their holidays? How's the calendar work? Go back to clothing again. How does education work? Are the people highly educated? Can most people read? Is there a select group of people that can read? Are there different languages? Do they have different significances? How do economics work? And then all of these things, attitudes. And then think about, if you've got magic and psionics, how accepted are they in the world? As you know, some worlds over the years that people have created, people could use magic, but then they would deplete, life force from the world. And so mages in those worlds could be incredibly useful, but you didn't want to admit it because people essentially viewed you as killing the world. And remember the Stafford principle, that there's going to be some reason that you're creating your world. What are those special aspects? What are those special aspects of your world that you want your players to be aware of? And so if you've got a really cool elemental magic system, then at least some of your non-player characters ought to be that particular elemental mage specialty. Or maybe there's a place in the world that's full of elemental fire magic that your players could go visit at some point. I would make sure that you highlighted the things that you're proudest of about that world and make it a kind of a cool place. You want to make your world truly unique. You don't want it to be a cookie cutter place. Because you want to always ask the question, why would somebody choose to sit at your gaming table? Why would they choose to come and spend time in your world when they could do anything else? There's an opportunity cost to playing your world. They're not doing something else. Why are they going to spend time with you? Okay, so one of the things you want to do now, you've got this whole world put together, I would do a consistency check. So if you've got a non-gaming friend or relative, if you've got somebody in your life who's a writer, you'd like to bounce the world off of them and make sure that it makes sense from their perspective. And you got to be willing to listen to your advisors. You can always include things you want to include, but you probably ought to go back and make sure that they make sense in the broader context. One of the things that and we talked about it already, is if you've got a really cool aspect to your world, I would find a non-player character who can highlight that aspect of your world, that they come from that particular really neat culture, or they are practitioners of that particular special magic style, or they're one of the few psionics in the world, and just to kind of show off a little bit, do some cheetah flips for your players. And then if you have a very unique, interesting area, shamelessly put MacGuffins in that would draw your players to explore those particular special aspects. And that's the same in bottom up, as where, hey, I just bought this new module. I just spent 20 of my hard-earned cash. I want you to go to this module. So therefore, I'm going to talk about the library of Mango the Mad. I'm going to talk about this legendary beast. Same kind of thing when you talk about the cool areas of your world. And then again, no matter how much time you lavish on creating your world, you're not going to be able to create all the subatomic interactions. You just can't. There's not enough time in the history of the universe. So you're going to have to ad lib from time to time. It'll be more consistent because you've developed the world. Make sure when you ad lib, you write it down. I don't know how many times early on in the first 10 years of game mastering, somebody caught me on something I said as I would ad libbing, and I wasn't paying enough attention to write it down, or thought that I would remember it. Okay, so these are things we've all talked about already, so I'm going to go through these rapidly. So first thing is, all of those non-player characters, everything to do with your world, it's imaginary. So when your players go in and they kill this non-player character you've lavished all your attention and emotional energy into, that's okay. You don't turn around to a TPK out of rage or something. It's all imaginary. The most important thing is that people have fun and you had fun creating the world. Also, just because you created something and you like it, later on, because your players they're gonna test the limits of your world, you've got to be willing to modify things that are inconsistent. And this one's hard. This one's really hard. I, like many of you, are going to patch things because I like this, and eventually it's just going to collapse under its own weight. And I think you ought to do this sooner than later. Sometimes inconsistencies exist, and it's okay because it's a minor inconsistency. Sometimes they're significant, and they're going to really affect people's ability to suspend disbelief. So be willing to do that. Take notes in the creation process, because you're going to want to come back to those notes later, because you're not going to remember 3 months from now why you did a particular thing. So write it down. We talked about this one already. Foot stomped it. Closer to Earth, easier to visualize, but less exciting and interesting. And then the more different and weird it is, the more fun potentially, but at the same time, also harder to visualize potentially. Okay, I would start small. Remember Sandy's axiom. I would try to think about, what do things look like, what do they sound like, but also what are the smells, what are the touches, maybe the tastes in the world. And we got to use all of people's senses if you're going to suspend disbelief. And then this is a kind of a business rule. I would spend 80% of my time working on things that your players and player characters are going to spend 80% of their time looking at. Otherwise, you run into the potential for wasting a lot of time doing something that's not going to have a lot of return on investment. Okay, so how do you organize your world? We're coming here to the end. First thing is, these binders can be virtual. These binders could be virtual. It might be in Scrivener. It could be in notes on an iPad. It could be in actual physical binders. But early on, when you create your world, I would organize it. So you could do it by geography. You could do it by history. You could do it by, intelligent species, some combination. And I would start an index early on. I would write keywords and say what notebook or what file things are in particular in, because you're not going to remember it 6 months from now when somebody asks you a question. Okay, so top-down development. Here we go. So this is the world that I created with a lot of help from a lot of other people over the years. I stole liberally from many sources, but I took aspects of it and I recreated it, with a consistent cosmology and theology from my perspective. So in 1987, when the first time I wrote this all down, I was running a campaign in Germany back in those days, not far from a place called Stuttgart. This is the first time I actually drew the map of the world. I knew what it kind of looked like in my head beforehand, but the first player map that I ever gave anybody, this was the very, very first one that I gave them. So 1987. And why did I do that? Well, so the gaming system I used was RuneQuest 2. To tell you how old this was, way, way back when. What were the origins of the universe? That was a secret. That was the secret, is where it came from. And when I talked about magic and religion, I said that gods are real and they affect daily life, and psionics are real but rarer. I stole this idea more or less from Greg Stafford and his world in Glorantha. The gods are real and they affect daily life. The geography of this thing is ginormous. This is a huge, absolutely huge world. This isle is probably, this island alone is probably about half the size of South America, just as an idea. And the energy cycle, I decided to mostly keep it close to what Earth normal is. So those were kind of the initial decisions that I made. All right. So now what I'd like you to do is, I know you've all been very patiently muted. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to spend this last little bit of time with you actually developing. I'd actually like to spend some time with you developing a world. So if you could, those of you who want to speak, if you'd like to unmute at this point. Yeah. So yeah, right here. Can you see that? It's the same place you went to get to this site, xalandor.com/seminars, and there's a thing called handouts. And what I'll do on the news page of my site, is I'll go ahead and I'm gonna post this in the next 6 hours. I've got kind of back-to-back seminars, but what I will do this evening when I'm done is I'll make sure, if you go to the news tab on my site, I will have this location. I will specify this location for you guys. So again, thank you very, very much. And I hope everybody has a fabulous, good day and a wonderful, wonderful Gen Con. Thank you all so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You bet. You bet. Okay.
Thank you.
You bye. See you at the next seminars. All right. Have a great day. Rich out.